Hey everyone, thanks for joining in. So, I read this quote today from a book called "The End of Death" by Nuke Sanchez. It's my favorite book about the Course. Um, she just doesn't hold back. And here's the first paragraph of chapter one. The ego, a brief overview. From my courage vantage point, after more than 2 decades of walking the path of A Course in Miracles, I see clearly that the ego is nothing more than the will to suffer. It's also an unconscious desire to be alone and separate. I'm going to read the second paragraph too. Yet who in his right mind would ever consistently choose to suffer all alone for aeons in the illusion of time? No one would if he was truly in his right mind. Clearly, the ego thought system is the wrong mind. Life as we know it, as lived through the unconscious ego, is chock full of all kinds of suffering. Thank you so much, Nuke. Wow. Um, so the thing is, most of us have approached spirituality and heard the term ego before. And even people who haven't, it's a very common, out and about in the world, like, oh, that person has a lot of ego, or oh, that was a really egotistical thing to do. It's kind of a common phrase. And so that's one of the traps of that word is thinking like, oh, it's just ego, right? Like, oh, it's no big deal. It's just ego. Well, as Nuke puts it so well, the ego is the will to suffer. As Jesus says in the Course of Miracles, and I have to paraphrase here, that the ego daily worships the crucifixion of the Son of God and forget the exact phrase, something like bathes in the blood or drinks in the blood. So so if we're gonna really use the word ego and really um, from a spiritual point of view, we need to be clear that the ego is that which would every day celebrate the crucifixion of Christ. Like that was the most glorious event that ever occurred. So let's celebrate it every day. And let's reenact it every day. That's what that's what we're up against. That level of insanity. Um, something that really helped me to understand the ego was one of the most Christ-like beings I've ever heard of. This man named Bruno Gröning, who you can do a little research about him. Very interesting being, but he didn't use the word ego. He used the word evil, and he said evil is seeking to destroy the planet, to destroy this planet. And that really put it in perspective to me. That really woke me up to what the Course was talking about. That it's one thing to say like, oh, the ego, yeah, the ego wants me to suffer, or the ego's, but how destructive, how vicious is it? It actually wants to destroy this planet. Can you imagine? I mean, in Star Wars, right? Like that's the symbol of the ultimate evil, like the desire to destroy a planet. Now, of course, we're talking here in relative terms, but that's what really woke me up to the insanity of the ego. So, the will to suffer. Wow. So I was just really sitting with that, and I did something today that I normally don't do. I've had a very long history with video games, which that's quite the tale. But lately, I've just been letting myself play for like 15 minutes a day and really observing how I feel during them, what it's like from a little bit more, I'd say a conscious place. Normally, I'd play in the past, as a a destructive habit is something to go unconscious. Um, but instead of just like being like, okay, I'm not going to do it, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to do it a little bit and really observe and be present and actually, work miracles. Be aware of my thoughts as they arose and work miracles while playing these video games. And the first thing I noticed was that, well, and of course this is a violent game. It's called League of Legends, and you play against other players, which is very interesting. It's one thing to play a video game where you're just seeking to kill computer animated, whatevers. But this, there are other people on other computers that you're playing against, and you're seeking to kill each other. Oh my! Well, playing a video game while conscious, the moment the game started to load, there started to be this feeling of fear in the body, like adrenaline was pumping. Like intellectually, it's like this is a video game. Nobody's gonna die. But on this other level, and then I watched throughout the game, as there were points where my character, at points in the game where my character was in danger, I would notice there would be flutters of fear throughout the body. And I remember one moment specifically, um, and I promise I will connect this all to the course in one moment. There's one moment where I was just kind of paused, waiting, and I was like, "Ooh, someone might be in the bushes waiting to ambush me." And there was like this like flutter of fear, of terror, really. Like the heart started to pound, and so it was very insightful for me because that's what the ego is into. I wouldn't say so much it's the will. I mean, it is, I guess, but for me, I feel more like it's the addiction to suffering. It's the habit of suffering, and it's the continuous returning to suffering, and and that's what the ego is into. Now, see, I probably had been feeling those flutters every time I played in the past, but wasn't aware of it because I was unconscious and numbing out. And normally I would like overeat before I would play the video games. And um, but look at that. And so in one sense, that's an extreme example of, of moving towards that which creates terror, fear, and suffering. Um, and yet, when we look at our life choices, especially relationships, when we look at relationships and we look at moment by moment the things we choose to do with our time, it becomes, I mean, if you're a certain point on the awakening path, this won't apply. But you know, most of the things we choose when we're unconscious actually are harmful. Sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes not so subtle ways. It is. It's like we're drawn. The ego is because the ego, all it wants to do is maintain. I mean, the ego's end game is eternal hell, right? Like it wants eternal suffering and separation from God. That's how crazy it is. Forget trying to destroy the world, forget like addiction to suffering. What the ego wants is never ending torment for you, for me, for everyone and everything. That's all it wants. And you can observe your day, all the little choices that take us in that direction. A little extra food, um, a little numbing out through Facebook surfing, a little bit of this, a little bit, and that those little bits they start to add up to where, well, anyone who's gone down the hole far enough can tell you where life can become hell on earth. So that's the problem. That's what we're up against is insanity, the will to suffer, the addiction to suffering, the propensity, and oftentimes the unconscious propensity. And how tricky is that? For example, with the video games for years, I've been probably having this intense physical reaction, or maybe it was slightly less intense, but it's been kept unconscious for me. That's how slick the ego is. Yeah. So that's the problem. That's what we're up against. What's the solution? Well, the Course in Miracles doesn't claim to be the only way. In fact, it explicitly states that, um, it's one form of a universal curriculum to freedom. Um, so ultimately, I won't say ultimately, but a huge part of the path is humility, is sort of the ego's recognition of its own insanity. And then the other half is um, tasting, tasting the peace, bliss, love of God and the desire for that. In the course, Jesus says all that the teacher only has to do one thing: increase the student's motivation. And it's the only thing that needs to happen. Because with the recognition of, um, you know, and there's different ways to approach it. For some people, it might be more like, "Oh, the ego is insane. I want the freedom." Or other people, they might have had a mystical experience and tasted the bliss, love, peace of God, of oneness, of freedom. That could increase their motivation. For me, it's been a little bit of both, and I assume it's been a little bit of both for everyone. But actually, in some ways, the path itself is universal, and yet the twists and turns that we each take, um, and the timing of the different lessons is, of course, individual. So, the good news is, the good news is, okay. So the bad news with a lowercase b is you are just completely insane. Like, absolutely, you're a homicide. You, lowercase y, you're a homicidal, suicidal maniac in your clear moments. In your not so clear moments, you're hell bent on imprisoning yourself and everyone else in hell. That's the bad news with the lowercase b. The good news, which is another meaning of the word gospel, the capital G good news, is you're not going to be successful at that. You're actually going to fail. That's the good news. You're going to fail. The course says that, um, the ego has a very strong pain tolerance, meaning it can put up with a lot of suffering, but that pain tolerance is not infinite. And at a certain point, it does crumble. So, that's the good news. You're going to fail. That's just the first part of the good news. The other part of the good news is there's a way out, and you're actually not alone. And while it seems that the ego and sometimes it's helpful to me to use the word evil, evil again referring to, but just evil, that force which causes suffering. We don't want to, we don't want to put evil outside of ourselves. But anyway, it's just something that's been helpful for me. This force that causes suffering is, while it seems, especially here on the planet Earth, 21st century, it seems to be like, you know, unstoppable. It's like one grain of sand in the ocean of God. It's nothing. While it can sure seem like everything, and it can sure take people down some really dark create some really intense nightmares. I'm speaking from experience. I've experienced hell on earth. Didn't need to die to go to hell. And the other good news, and this is really, I shouldn't have delayed saying this, pardon me. The really good news with a capital G is that insane, sadist, masochist, homicidal, suicidal maniac, the ego isn't you. That's the really good news. It's maybe the ultimate good news. You are absolutely innocent. You are absolutely good. And you are absolutely free. And this is, the suffering is just, um, and I'm not discounting the pain that comes from these various dreams. It's pain. It's unspeakably painful. But I'm not denying the reality of the pain. I mean, ultimately, I would, but that's not helpful, really, right now. I am denying the reality of that which is causing the pain. It doesn't, yeah. So, so your comments, questions, feedback are very welcome, and ultimately, the course is really simple. It's very profound, very deep, in some ways very abstract, but it's actually really very simple. And it's learning to recognize what hurts and what doesn't. First, it's coming to the humility that, oh, I actually don't know what's good for me. As the course says, I don't perceive my own best interests. And then that gets really simple of thought by thought, watching the thoughts, and any thought that engenders fear, which means any suffering of any kind, giving that thought over to the Holy Spirit and asking for a miracle, which is another way of asking for a true thought. Thanks so much for watching. Wish you a glorious day, mindfulness of your thoughts. And I wish for you an increase in motivation to be free, to be free of the maniac. And let's face it, the evil, the ego, I use those words interchangeably. But the ego, for all intensive purposes, it's if you want to understand the ego, just go read some traditional Christian literature about the devil, and then the qualities of the devil: sneaky, nasty, cunning, baffling, seeks the enslavement of souls, the destruction of lives, complete lack of anything good. And that's a really great description of the ego. Okay. I wish you all much peace and love to hear your feedback. Thank you.